Son missing for 9 years. One day he stands outside his father's shop. The brass bell above the door chimed its familiar tune as Mrs. Henderson shuffled into Ellis Corner Deli, her walker scraping against the worn wooden floor. Franklin Ellis looked up from behind the counter, his weathered hands still moving with practiced precision as he sliced turkey for the lunch rush. "The usual, Mrs. H?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. In 9 years of running this place alone, he'd memorized every regular customer's order. Ham on rye, mustard, no pickle. Coffee, black, 2 sugars. "You know me too well, Franklin," she replied, settling onto the red vinyl stool that had seen better days. Her eyes drifted to the chalkboard menu hanging crooked on the wall. "Though I still wonder about that sandwich you make every Saturday. The one with the strange ingredients." Frank's knife paused mid-slice. Even after all these years, that sandwich still drew questions. Peanut butter, banana, and pickle on sourdough. He'd never written it on the menu, never offered it to customers, yet somehow word had spread through the neighborhood about the odd combination. "Just something I do," he murmured, wrapping her sandwich in white paper with the care of someone who understood that small rituals mattered. The truth was more complicated than he'd ever admit to his customers. Every Saturday morning, Frank would arrive at the shop an hour early, before the sun painted the storefront windows gold. He'd unlock the door, flip on the lights, and begin the routine that had become his anchor in a world that had shifted off its axis 9 years ago. First, he'd take out the sourdough bread, always the heel pieces, because Max had loved those best. "They're like little bread boats, Dad," his 8-year-old son had declared one morning, using them to scoop up scrambled eggs. Then came the peanut butter, spread thick and even, just how Max liked it. The banana, sliced into perfect rounds. And finally the dill pickle, not spears, but thin circular slices, because Max insisted they looked like green coins. The combination had horrified Frank's late wife, Sarah. "That child's taste buds are broken," she'd laughed, watching Max devour the creation with pure joy. But Frank had secretly tried it once, after Sarah passed, and found it wasn't terrible. Sweet, salty, tangy, and creamy all at once. It was chaos in sandwich form, much like Max himself had been. Every Saturday, Frank made the sandwich, wrapped it carefully, and placed it on the counter next to the register. He'd leave it there until closing time, then quietly dispose of it before heading upstairs to his small apartment above the shop. He told himself it was just habit, muscle memory from the days when Max would burst through the door after Saturday morning cartoons, demanding his special sandwich before they'd head to the park. But deep down, Frank knew it was hope disguised as routine. Hope that somehow, someday, his son would walk through that door again. The day Max disappeared had started like any other Saturday. The autumn school carnival was in full swing, complete with face painting, ring toss, and a haunted house made from classroom dividers and old sheets. Sarah had been gone for 2 years by then, lost to cancer when Max was only 6. It was just Frank and Max against the world, and Frank thought he was doing okay as a single father. Max had been excited about the carnival for weeks, saving his allowance for game tickets and practicing his bowling technique with empty soup cans in their living room. Frank remembered watching his son dart between game booths, his Superman cape, a red towel safety pinned to his shirt, flying behind him as he ran. "Dad, watch this!" Max had called, winding up to throw a softball at a pyramid of milk bottles. Frank had turned away for just a moment to buy cotton candy from the PDA booth. When he looked back, Max was gone. The search had lasted 3 days. Police dogs, volunteers, helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. They'd combed through every inch of the school grounds, the surrounding woods, and the nearby creek. They'd interviewed every adult at the carnival, checked security footage from the few cameras in the area, and issued Amber Alerts that flashed on highway signs for hundreds of miles. But Max had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The detective on the case, a kind woman named Rodriguez, had explained the statistics to Frank in gentle terms. Most missing children were found within 72 hours. After that, the chances dropped dramatically. After a week, they dropped to almost nothing. After a month, families were usually advised to prepare for the worst. Frank had refused to prepare for anything except Max walking back through their front door. Now, 9 years later, he'd settled into a life that existed in the space between moving forward and standing still. He ran the deli because it was what he knew, what Sarah had helped him build from nothing. He served the same customers, made the same sandwiches, and tried not to think about the boy who would now be 17 years old. The afternoon crowd was typical for a Tuesday, a few office workers grabbing late lunch, teenagers counting coins for candy, and old Mr. Peterson nursing his third cup of coffee while working on crossword puzzles. Frank moved through the familiar motions, slicing, wrapping, ringing up orders, making small talk about the weather and the local high school's chances in the upcoming football season. But always, in the back of his mind, was that Saturday sandwich. The ritual that had become both his salvation and his torment. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if he stopped making it. Would that mean he'd finally given up? Would it mean Max was truly gone? The bell chimed again as the last customer of the day headed home. Frank began his closing routine, wiping down counters, restocking napkin dispensers, and calculating the day's modest profits. The shop wasn't making him rich, but it paid the bills and gave him a reason to get out of bed each morning. As he locked the register, Frank's eyes drifted to the framed photo tucked behind the coffee pot. It showed him, Sarah, and Max at the beach 3 summers before Sarah got sick. Max was building an elaborate sand castle, his tongue poking out in concentration, while Sarah laughed at something Frank had said. They looked like any normal family enjoying a perfect day. Frank touched the glass gently, then turned off the lights and headed upstairs. Tomorrow was Wednesday, which meant the usual rhythm of roast beef and turkey clubs, soup of the day, and coffee refills. But Saturday was coming, as it always did, bringing with it the familiar weight of hope and memory wrapped in sourdough bread. He didn't know it yet, but this Saturday would be different. This Saturday, after 9 years of making sandwiches for ghosts, someone would finally be there to eat one. The summer heat pressed against the shop windows like an unwelcome visitor, making the old air conditioning unit wheeze and groan in protest. Frank wiped sweat from his forehead as he assembled a club sandwich for the lunch crowd, grateful that Tuesday's rush had finally died down to a manageable trickle. The brass bell announced another customer, and Frank glanced up to see a teenager silhouetted in the doorway. The boy paused there for a moment, as if unsure whether to enter, before stepping into the cool interior of the shop. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sun-weathered look that spoke of long days spent outdoors. His clothes were dusty from travel, faded jeans with worn knees, a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days, and sneakers that looked like they'd walked more miles than most cars. Frank continued working, stealing glances at the boy as he approached the counter. There was something about the way he moved, hesitant but determined, like someone following a half-remembered dream. The teenager's eyes swept across the handwritten menu board, studying each item with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone just looking for lunch. "Take your time," Frank said, sliding the completed club sandwich across to Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop 3 doors down. "Everything's made fresh daily." The boy nodded absently, still reading. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made Frank's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Something familiar tugged at the edges of his memory, but he pushed it aside. After 9 years, he'd learned that hope could be a cruel companion. The teenager said, his voice carrying the slight crack of someone caught between boy and man. "This might sound weird, but do you make a sandwich with peanut butter, banana, and pickle?" Frank's hands went completely still. The knife he'd been using to slice tomatoes clattered onto the cutting board, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second dragging by as Frank processed what he'd just heard. The sandwich wasn't on the menu. It had never been on the menu. In 9 years of running the shop, Frank had never once advertised that particular combination. The only people who knew about it were the handful of neighbors who'd seen him make it during his Saturday ritual, and even they didn't know the real reason behind it. What did you say?" Frank's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The boy shifted nervously, mistaking Frank's shock for annoyance. I know it sounds gross. Most people think I'm crazy when I mention it. But I've been craving it for weeks, and I thought maybe. He trailed off, suddenly looking much younger than his years. Never mind. It was a stupid question. Frank forced himself to look up, really look at the teenager for the first time. What he saw made the world tilt on its axis. The eyes were the same, deep brown with flecks of gold that caught the light just so. The nose was the same too, straight and narrow, though it now fit a face that had lost its childhood roundness. The mouth was different, fuller and more serious than Frank remembered, but when the boy spoke, there was an echo of something heartbreakingly familiar. This was Max, older, taller, weathered by years Frank couldn't account for, but unmistakably his son. The teenager was backing toward the door, clearly uncomfortable with Frank's prolonged stare. Sorry to bother you, man. I'll just get a regular sandwich or something. Wait, Frank said, his voice stronger now. What's your name? The boy paused, one hand on the door handle. Jordan. Jordan. Smith. The last name came out like an afterthought, as if it didn't quite fit. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. Max wouldn't remember his real name, he'd been so young when he disappeared. But Jordan looked confused by Frank's reaction, tilting his head in a gesture so achingly familiar that Frank had to grip the counter to keep from falling. I can make that sandwich, Frank managed. The peanut butter one. Give me just a minute. Jordan's face lit up with surprised gratitude. Really? That's awesome. I've been looking for someone who'd make it for months. Frank's hands moved on autopilot, assembling the sandwich he'd made countless times before. But this time felt different. This time, someone would actually eat it. This time, the ritual wasn't just about holding on to the past, it was about reaching toward an impossible future. He spread the peanut butter with trembling fingers, arranged the banana slices with surgical precision, and added the pickle rounds that looked like tiny green coins. The sourdough bread came together like pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 9 years. Here you go, Frank said, sliding the wrapped sandwich across the counter. His voice was thick with emotions he couldn't name. Jordan reached for his wallet with one hand while unwrapping a corner of the sandwich with the other. He took a small bite, and his eyes widened with something that looked like recognition mixed with disbelief. This is exactly how I remembered it, he whispered, more to himself than to Frank. How did you know? Before Frank could answer, Jordan was backing toward the door again, clutching the sandwich like a lifeline. I gotta go. Thanks for this. You have no idea what this means. And then he was gone, leaving Frank alone with the lingering scent of pickles and the earth-shattering realization that his son, his Max, had just walked out of his life for the second time. Frank stood frozen behind the counter for several minutes, his mind racing between disbelief and desperate certainty. The logical part of his brain whispered that he was seeing things that weren't there, that grief had finally driven him to hallucinations. But his heart knew better. A father doesn't forget his child's eyes, even when they're looking back at him from a face that's grown 9 years older. The afternoon customers came and went in a blur. Frank made sandwiches on autopilot, his hands working while his thoughts churned. Where had Jordan gone? How far could a teenager on foot travel in this heat? And most importantly, how could he approach him without scaring him away again? At 3 o'clock, Frank did something he'd never done in 9 years of running the shop alone. He flipped the sign to "Closed" and locked the door. If Mrs. Henderson needed her evening coffee, she'd have to understand. Some things were more important than business. The neighborhood wasn't large, just a few square blocks of modest homes, small businesses, and tree-lined streets that had changed little since Frank was a boy himself. He started walking, checking every bench, every bus stop, every shaded doorway where a tired teenager might rest. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, but Frank barely noticed. He was a man with a mission, driven by 9 years of accumulated hope. 20 minutes into his search, Frank spotted him. Jordan sat under an ancient oak tree in Riverside Park, the same park where Frank used to push Max on the swings every Saturday afternoon. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy was positioned with his back against the trunk, legs stretched out in front of him, completely absorbed in devouring the sandwich Frank had made. Frank approached slowly, the way you might approach a skittish animal. Each step felt monumental, weighted with the possibility that this moment could shatter like glass if he moved too quickly. Jordan was so focused on eating that he didn't notice Frank until he was just a few feet away. "Mind if I sit?" Frank asked, gesturing to a nearby bench. Jordan looked up, startled, a bit of banana clinging to his lower lip. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not the deep recognition Frank hoped for, but the surface acknowledgement of the sandwich shop owner. "Oh, hey. Sure, I guess." Frank settled onto the weathered bench, close enough to talk but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. Up close, the family resemblance was even more striking. Jordan had Sarah's chin and the same way of chewing thoughtfully that Frank remembered from countless family dinners. "Hot day for walking around," Frank observed casually. Jordan nodded, taking another bite. "Yeah, but I don't mind. I've gotten used to it." He paused, seeming to realize how that sounded. "I mean, I do a lot of hiking and stuff." "You're not from around here?" "Not really. I've been traveling for a while now." Jordan's voice carried a wariness that broke Frank's heart. This was a kid who'd learned not to trust easily, who'd grown up in a world where adults weren't automatically safe. Frank pulled a bottle of water from his jacket pocket, a habit left over from the days when Max would get thirsty during their park visits. "You look like you could use this." Jordan's eyes widened with genuine gratitude. "Thanks, man. That's really nice of you." He accepted the water and drank deeply, then seemed to catch himself being too eager. "I can pay you for it. Don't worry about it." Frank watched as Jordan continued eating, noting the way he savored each bite like it was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. "So what brought you to my shop? That's a pretty specific sandwich to ask for." Jordan's expression grew distant, almost dreamy. "It's going to sound crazy, but I've been having these. I don't know what to call them. Dreams? Memories? They're not clear, just bits and pieces." He gestured with the sandwich. "But this taste, this exact combination, it's been in my head for months. I kept thinking I was making it up, you know? Like, what kind of person craves peanut butter and pickles?" Frank's throat tightened. "Where do you think the craving came from?" "I don't know. I don't remember much from when I was really little." Jordan's voice grew quieter. "I aged out of foster care a few months ago. Been on my own since then, just following these weird feelings and half-memories. Stupid, probably." "Not stupid at all," Frank said gently. "Sometimes our bodies remember things our minds have forgotten." Jordan looked at him with surprise, as if no adult had ever validated his experiences before. "Exactly. That's exactly how it feels. Like my taste buds have memories my brain doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Jordan finishing his sandwich while Frank wrestled with how much to reveal. Too much too soon would send the boy running. Too little might mean losing him again. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" Frank asked finally. Jordan shrugged, trying to look nonchalant. "I'll figure something out. Always do. I've got a spare room above the shop," Frank said, his heart pounding. "Nothing fancy, just a bed and a dresser. You could stay the night, maybe help me with the morning rush in exchange for breakfast." Jordan studied Frank's face, looking for hidden motives or ulterior plans. Whatever he saw there must have reassured him, because he nodded slowly. "That would be great, actually. I'm pretty tired." As they walked back toward the shop, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in 9 years, the simple pleasure of having his son beside him, even if that son didn't know who he was yet. It would have to be enough for now. The spare room above the shop hadn't been used since Sarah's sister visited 3 years ago. Frank had kept it clean but sparse, just a single bed with a blue quilt, a wooden dresser with a cracked mirror, and dusty curtains that filtered the evening light into golden streams. Jordan stood in the doorway, taking it all in with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned not to expect comfort. "This is perfect," he said, dropping his worn backpack onto the bed. Thank you. Really? Frank lingered in the hallway, unsure how to navigate this strange new reality. Bathroom's just down the hall. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. But as Jordan settled in, Frank found himself drawn back upstairs under the pretense of bringing fresh towels and checking that the window fan was working. In truth, he was memorizing everything. The way Jordan arranged his few belongings with military precision, how he tested the bed's firmness before sitting, the unconscious habit of checking the room's exits. These were the behaviors of a child who'd grown up in temporary spaces, never knowing when he might need to leave quickly. The next morning, Jordan appeared in the kitchen before Frank had even started the coffee, dressed and ready despite the early hour. "Put me to work," he said simply. "I always pay my debts." Frank handed him an apron, one of Sarah's old ones with cheerful daisies printed on blue fabric. As Jordan tied it around his waist, Frank noticed his hands pause at the strings, his brow furrowing slightly as if trying to place a memory just out of reach. "You okay?" Frank asked. "Yeah, this feels familiar somehow." Jordan shook his head and smiled. "Probably just reminds me of some movie or something." Throughout the morning rush, Frank watched Jordan work with growing amazement. The boy moved through the kitchen like he'd been born there, anticipating what Frank needed before being asked, finding supplies without direction. When the coffee ran low, Jordan had a fresh pot brewing before Frank noticed. When they ran out of napkins at the counter, Jordan was already restocking from the supply closet. "You've done this before," Frank observed during a brief lull. Jordan paused while wiping down tables. "Not that I remember. But my hands seem to know what they're doing." He laughed, but there was uncertainty behind it. "Muscle memory, maybe?" Frank's heart ached watching his son try to make sense of instincts that came from a childhood he couldn't recall. During the lunch prep, Frank began his subtle campaign of memory triggers, starting small. "Could you grab that mug from the top shelf?" he asked, pointing to a red ceramic cup decorated with a faded Superman logo. It had been Max's favorite, the one he'd insisted on using for chocolate milk every night before bed. Jordan reached for it without question, but as his fingers closed around the handle, he went very still. He turned the mug slowly, studying the worn superhero emblem. "This is cool," he said quietly. "Superman was always my favorite." "Mine too," Frank replied, his voice carefully casual. "Had the costume and everything when I was a kid." Something flickered across Jordan's face, a half-formed memory trying to surface. He set the mug down gently, treating it like something precious. Later, while Jordan swept the dining area, Frank hummed softly under his breath. It was an old lullaby, one Sarah used to sing while tucking Max into bed. The melody was simple, repetitive, designed to soothe a restless child's mind. Jordan's sweeping gradually slowed, then stopped altogether. He stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, broom in hand, his eyes distant and unfocused. "I know that song," he whispered. Frank's humming trailed off. "Oh? It's just something my wife used to sing. A woman used to sing it to me." Jordan's voice was barely audible. "I can almost see her face, but not quite. She had brown hair and she smelled like cinnamon." Frank's eyes filled with tears. Sarah had always worn cinnamon-scented lotion, a habit that had filled their home with the warm spice's comforting aroma. He turned away quickly, pretending to organize receipts while he composed himself. That evening, Frank made his boldest move yet. He retrieved Max's childhood blanket from the bottom of his dresser drawer, a soft yellow fleece that still carried the faintest trace of cinnamon from all those nights Sarah had held it while rocking their son to sleep. "Gets cold up there at night sometimes," Frank said, handing it to Jordan. "This might help." Jordan accepted the blanket, burying his face in the soft fabric without thinking. When he breathed in, his entire body went rigid. "This smell," he said, his voice breaking. "I know this smell." Frank watched as Jordan clutched the blanket to his chest, his young face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like grief for memories he couldn't quite grasp. "It's okay," Frank said gently. "Sometimes remembering takes time." The next morning, Frank found Jordan in the kitchen, still wrapped in the yellow blanket, staring at a photograph Frank had left on the counter. It showed an 8-year-old Max grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and wild-haired, holding up a trophy from the school's science fair. Jordan's finger traced the edges of the photo with infinite care. "That feels like me," he said softly, not looking up. "But how is that possible?" For 3 days, Jordan carried the photograph in his pocket, pulling it out during quiet moments to study the boy's face with intense concentration. Frank watched him struggle with memories that danced just beyond his grasp, wanting desperately to tell him the truth but knowing that Jordan needed to find his way back on his own terms. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon when the lunch rush had died down to nothing. The air conditioning had given up entirely, leaving the shop thick with humid air that made even breathing feel like work. Frank suggested they tackle some overdue cleaning in the storage room, a cramped space behind the kitchen where he kept extra supplies and old equipment. "This place is like an archaeological dig," Jordan laughed, moving boxes of paper cups and industrial-sized mail containers. "How long have you had this shop?" "About 12 years, Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Built it with my wife. She died when—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "When my son was 6. Jordan looked up from the box he was moving. "I'm sorry. That must have been really hard." "Hardest thing I ever went through," Frank admitted. "Well, second hardest." Something in his tone made Jordan pause, but before he could ask what the hardest thing had been, his attention was caught by something else entirely. The box he'd been moving had revealed a gap in the wooden wall paneling, just a small space where 2 boards didn't quite meet, hidden behind years of accumulated storage. "Hey, there's something carved in here," Jordan said, crouching down to peer into the gap. Frank's blood turned to ice. He'd forgotten about that hiding spot, the one Max had discovered when he was 7 years old during a game of hide-and-seek. His son had been so proud of his secret place, carefully carving his name into the hidden wood with a butter knife he'd smuggled from the kitchen. "It's probably just old graffiti," Frank said quickly, but Jordan was already working his fingers into the narrow space. "No, this is definitely letters. Hold on." Jordan maneuvered his phone's flashlight into the gap, and Frank heard him suck in a sharp breath. "Oh my God!" Jordan's hands began to shake as he traced the carved letters with his fingertip. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Max Ellis. Age 7. My dad says I can run this shop one day." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 9 years of separation and loss. Frank felt his knees go weak, and he had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. Jordan slowly pulled his hand back from the wall, staring at his fingers as if they'd been burned. "Max Ellis," Jordan repeated, and this time the name didn't sound foreign on his lips. It sounded like coming home. Frank watched as his son's face cycled through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then a dawning understanding that seemed to light him up from the inside. Jordan's eyes went wide, and he looked up at Frank with an expression of wonder mixed with devastating clarity. "You're my dad," he said, and it wasn't a question. The floodgates opened then. Not in a rush of dramatic revelation, but like a dam developing tiny cracks that suddenly give way all at once. Jordan Max pressed his palms against his temples as memories crashed over him in waves. The red balloon from the carnival. The sound of his mother singing while she cooked dinner. The way Frank's hands felt when they taught him to tie his shoes. Saturday mornings spent helping in the shop, standing on a step stool to reach the register. The Superman costume that made him feel invincible. The fort they'd built in the living room during a thunderstorm. And underneath it all, the taste of that impossible sandwich, peanut butter, banana, and pickle, the creation of a little boy who'd wanted to invent something all his own. "I remember," Max whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I remember the carnival. I remember getting lost. I remember calling for you, but..." His voice broke. "I remember being so scared." Frank couldn't hold back anymore. He crossed the small space between them and pulled his son into his arms, feeling how much taller Max had grown, how his shoulders had broadened, how his childhood softness had been replaced by the lean strength of a young man who'd learned to survive on his own. "I never stopped looking," Frank whispered into Max's hair, which still smelled faintly of the yellow blanket. "I never stopped hoping you'd come home." They stood there in the cluttered storage room, surrounded by boxes of supplies and old memories, crying for all the years they'd lost and all the ways their lives had been broken and rearranged. But mostly, they cried with relief that somehow, impossibly, they'd found their way back to each other. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Max said against Frank's shoulder. "You were just following the crumbs home," Frank replied, thinking of the sandwich that had led his son back to him. "You found your way back exactly when you were supposed to." 6 months later, the brass bell above the door of Ellis Corner Deli chimed with a different kind of music. Where once it had announced the arrival of customers into a quiet space filled with one man's carefully contained grief, it now welcomed them into a shop alive with the easy banter between father and son. "Order up!" Max called from behind the counter, sliding a wrapped sandwich across to Mr. Peterson, who'd become something of a regular since word spread about the deli's new energy. "1 turkey club, extra pickles, just how you like it." "Thanks, son," Mr. Peterson said, and the casual endearment no longer made Frank's chest tighten with loss. Instead, it filled him with quiet pride as he watched Max, no longer Jordan, no longer the scared teenager who'd wandered in seeking a taste of forgotten comfort, move through the shop with the confident ease of someone who belonged. The lunch rush was in full swing, a familiar chaos that Frank had once navigated alone but now shared with the partner he'd always imagined he'd have. Max had slipped back into the rhythm of the shop like he'd never left, his muscle memory intact even after 9 years away. He knew where Frank kept the good tomatoes, could predict when they'd run low on coffee, and had an uncanny ability to read customers' moods and know exactly what kind of small talk they needed. "Dad, we're running low on that sourdough bread," Max said, appearing at Frank's elbow with the same stealth he possessed as a child. "Want me to call the bakery?" Frank still felt a small thrill every time Max called him Dad, the word carrying 9 years of weight and wonder. "Already handled it. They'll deliver at 2. Mrs. Henderson shuffled in, her walker scraping familiarly against the floor. But instead of her usual quiet demeanor, she wore a broad smile that had become her standard expression since Max's return. "There's my favorite sandwich artist," she announced, settling onto her red vinyl stool. "How's that young man of yours doing in school?" Max had enrolled in night classes to finish his high school diploma, something Frank had suggested but never pushed. The boy, the young man, had an intelligence sharpened by years of surviving on his own, and he attacked his studies with the same determination he brought to everything else. "Got an A on my history essay," Max said, assembling Mrs. Henderson's usual order with practiced hands. "Wrote about the importance of family businesses in small communities." Frank felt his throat tighten with pride. Max had chosen to write about their shop, about the way places like this served as anchors for neighborhoods, threads that wove communities together. The teacher had been so impressed she'd asked to display it in the main hallway. The afternoon crowd thinned out as it always did around 3, leaving father and son to work on prep for the next day. They moved together in comfortable synchronization, Frank slicing vegetables while Max restocked supplies, both of them humming along to the oldies station that played from the radio perched behind the coffee machine. It was Max who brought up the subject that had been dancing around the edges of their conversations for weeks. "I've been thinking about the menu," he said, wiping down the counter with circular motions that mirrored Frank's own technique. "About adding something new." Frank looked up from the onions he was dicing. "Oh? What did you have in mind?" Max grinned, the same impish expression he'd worn as an 8-year-old plotting some harmless mischief. "Well, there's this sandwich. Kind of weird combination, but I think people might like it if they gave it a chance." Frank's knife paused mid-chop. "Peanut butter, banana, and pickle? On sourdough," Max confirmed. "I was thinking we could call it the Max Special." The sandwich that had been Frank's private ritual of grief, his Saturday morning communion with loss and hope, transformed in that moment into something entirely different. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a memorial to what was gone, but a celebration of what had been found. "I think that's a perfect addition to the menu," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. They worked together to update the chalkboard, Max's neat handwriting adding the new item at the bottom of the list. When they finished, they stepped back to admire their work. "You know what's funny?" Max said, bumping his shoulder against Frank's in a gesture of casual affection that spoke of comfort regained. "I never did remember everything. Some of those years are still just blank." Frank nodded. They talked about this before, about the gaps in Max's memory that might never be filled, about the experiences he'd had in foster care that he sometimes shared and sometimes kept to himself. "But it doesn't matter," Max continued, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm not that scared little boy who got lost at the carnival anymore. And I'm not the kid who bounced between homes either. I'm just me, right here, right now, with you." Frank pulled his son into a sideways hug, breathing in the scent of sourdough and possibility. Outside, the neighborhood settled into the comfortable rhythm of a summer evening, and inside Ellis Corner Deli, two people who'd found their way back to each other prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring, one sandwich at a time.